Tara is the, thank you, Danine, I always forget that. Tara is the director and the co-founder of Table, which is a global platform for knowledge synthesis, for reflective critical thinking, and for inclusive dialogue and debate on the future of food. So a very broad and important topic. It's also the main topic of her talk, so I'll let her tell us more about Table specifically in a minute. And I'll just give a bit more background. So Tara has been working on food system sustainability issues for over 25 years. First in the nonprofit sector and more recently in academia. She founded the Food Climate Research Network in 2005 while at the University of Surrey, which is a global research community investigating the links between food and climate change that I believe grew to count more than 3,000 members globally by the end of its tenure, before it evolved into what is now Table last year in 2021. Since 2012, Tara has been based academically at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. And she's worked on a very rich range of food system sustainability issues and dimensions, with a particular interest in the livestock sector as a sort of zone where many of the thorniest environmental, health and cultural issues around food converge. In 2015, she was awarded the Premio Daniel Carasso, which is a prize for work on sustainable food systems and diets for long-term health. That's the background. Personally, I've been covertly following and learning from Tara's work on food systems since around 2013, when I was working in the nonprofit sector. And I've always just found that she has a very broad range of interest and expertise, and also a very helpful ability to get to some of the core issues and contentions at the heart of what can be very, very complex debates. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about her current work and her ambitions with the Table program. So Tara, with that, please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you very much. It was quite a grand introduction, and I should just preface all this by saying that Table is also quite small, but I'll come on to that in a little bit. So the title of my talk is really, what's really underneath it is a talk that's going to be about values. And because this is, I think, really fundamental to why we set up Table and where I think we are right now in kind of food system thinking and debate. So I thought I'd just start, and sort of Guy asked me to start with a sort of basic slide like this, which sort of kind of tethers the discussion in within the context of a kind of well-known set of sort of facts and figures about food. And I can see that all my arrows have gone really strange in this big screen mode. But really, the point of this slide is simply to say that we all know that the food system is implicated in and affected by a whole range of social, ethical, and environmental issues. The two perhaps most prominent areas are obviously environmental problems, where food accounts for, depending on which statistics you use, between a quarter and a third of global food impacts, main driver of biodiversity loss, land use change, water use and pollution, and so forth. We know all this. It's kind of very well known now. It's the subject of loads of newspaper articles and so forth. And we also know that the food system, one way or another, is implicated in some of the major health problems we face, and also is now the leading cause of death, which is another way of putting it is that we've managed to solve all the communicable disease problems, or not all of them, but we've got better at solving them. You have to die of something, so we're now dying later on in life of the foods that we eat, which are increasingly kind of lacking in diversity, high in calories, fat, sugar, salt, and so on and so forth. But we also know that food is really, really important to people's livelihoods. 25% of the global population works in agriculture, and that number is going to be very, very much higher in some parts of the world. And then you've got all the employment, formal and informal, further along the supply chain. So that's the kind of preface type slide to this talk. But what I thought I would really focus on is how we've got to a situation where those sorts of facts and figures are really, really well known, and where we haven't got to yet. So this is partly a sort of a personal account of my understanding of how food discussions have evolved over the last 25 years or so that I've been working in them. And I personally first encountered issues around food when I was volunteering for a small charity, which then ended up becoming Sustain, which is quite a well-known food NGO here in the UK. It was then called the Safe Alliance, and it published a report which was led by Tim Lang on the topic of food miles. And it focused on food miles as this major, major issue of concern, which was to do with the energy use, the fossil fuels used in the transport of goods all across the world. But it was about very, very much more than just energy. It really framed food miles. It saw them as the arteries of globalization and all its attendant ills. It talked about ghost acres, it talked about exploitation, it talked about biodiversity loss, it talked about loss of cultural identity, and so on and so forth. And it became a kind of shorthand for everything that was wrong with everything. And it had a huge amount of media attention, and many of you would be very well aware of this. So that's what really kind of got me thinking and working on food. But back at that time, I began to become aware of these early life cycle studies that started to be applied to food, which started to point out that food was actually, the transport aspect of food was only a kind of small part of the overall greenhouse gas emissions associated with food, and that in fact we needed to be looking more broadly at the whole supply chain. And this to me was quite revelatory, and it was the impetus for me sort of trying to set up the Food Climate Research Network as a means of trying to get people together to get a better understanding of how and why food contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So already something had been lost. There was this very interconnected way of looking at food, and then it became narrowed down. And I was part of this to focus on climate change. So kind of time passed, and then we gradually began to understand that yes, food contributes to all these emissions, and that in fact agriculture is the biggest contributor to the problem. And that therefore, if you're going to be talking about production, you have to talk about consumption, because we produce what we produce because we eat what we eat. So, and once you start thinking about those sorts of things, you have to start thinking about what food does to us. You have to start thinking about health. You have to start thinking about the animals that we rear and slaughter and all the ethics around that. We have to think about the fact that, this massive employer of people. We have to start thinking about biodiversity and land use change. So immediately we're starting to start to broaden out the food climate issue to encompass and intertwine with these other areas of concern. So again, time passing, and again, the language of food began to change from thinking about the supply chain to the value chain, which is sort of more about how profit accrues through the food system, but it also brings in the idea of activities and people. And then so we move on a bit further, and people start talking about these things, and then they start arguing for change. And then you start to get into discussions about power. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? Who ought to have it? Who ought not to have it? You're starting to talk about policy and who's responsible and who's to blame. And we're sort of towards that area now where we're starting to talk about the fact that everyone knows there's a problem, and we are also starting to think about food not so much as a chain, but as something much, much more complex and interactive as a system. So we all agree that it's a problem, but we're not necessarily clear what we want, and we don't necessarily agree. So, I mean, I think this is just to make the point that we recognize that the food is a system or a series of interlocking systems, that there's a ton of work going on by researchers within civil society, any big company worth its salt and its kind of paycheck is now, has a CSR report of one kind or another. We have a million analyses and so many recommendations, some of them very, very detailed and elaborate, and some of them 3 top tips to save the planet. So we have all this, but we don't seem to have a lot of agreement still beyond the kind of banalities. And my feeling is that polarization is seeming to be getting worse. So, I mean, these are just some easy slides that you see these sort of newspaper cuttings all the time, where, we had the Global Food Systems Summit last September, and for some, this was the way forward for the food system, and for others, it was boycotted. It had been so-called co-opted by big corporations, by people like Bill Gates, who is, some people's heroes and other people's Satan. We have whole sets of discussions about how we should produce, whether we should go GM or agroecology. Whatever you don't like gets branded as a form of neocolonialism. We have endless discussions about the question of the goods and bads of meat, and I think this is the kind of the slide where I want to talk about in a bit more detail later on, which is these different visions of what a good meat or a good meatless future looks like. And I'm going to just flag that up now and then come back to it at the end of this talk. So I think where we are now is that we have this quite detailed understanding of food systems problems and the interactions among these concerns. We have a strong stated commitment that we all want a lovely, sustainable food future, go off into the sunset, but less agreement as to what this actually means. And I think we talk a lot about the topics. We talk a lot about things like climate change or jobs or nutrition or whatever it might be. These are the things that we talk about. And there are many different kinds of often very contradictory approaches that we argue for or against around production methods, policy instruments, the role of corporations, the role of innovation, the need for civic action or education, and so on and so forth. We talk about all these things, but I think underlying it, there are some kind of deeper, more fundamental conversations going on. And I think what we're actually talking about is this, and these are the blobs that I want to talk about address in a bit more detail today. It's about ideas about power, it's about ideas about greed and limits, about freedom, about our relationship with nature, about the politics of knowledge, and about ideals versus practicality. So I think taking the first one, I think a really, really important strand in the discussions that we have about food are discussions about who and what is really, really to blame, what the core diagnosis of the problem is. So for some people, the problem is simply is that we're not quite yet smart enough. We need to innovate, we need to research more, we need better tech. Tech has always helped us save the day so far, and it's going to save the day again. So this is a world kind of, I guess, much favored by the eco-modernists who say the problem, the solution lies in progress, and progress is innovation. There's another way of thinking, which is a kind of equally old, perhaps older still, which says actually the problem is us. The problem is greed, flawed human nature, the fact that we simply we want too much, we don't know where to stop. And in fact, that is the key cause of the societal and of the environmental and the food related problems we face. And then there's a kind of third diagnosis, which puts it that it's not necessarily a question of too much or not enough, or too much innovation or not enough innovation, but it's the wrong power structures, it's inequality, it's injustice. And that takes a much more, socioeconomic approach to diagnosing the problems we face. So I think we see this knocking around in the reports of corporations on the one hand, NGOs on the other, and people of different sort of political persuasions within this broad movement. So I think that's one area of concern. I think the other set of discussions coming along are this idea of responsibility and power. So who has agency, who doesn't have agency, and how that drives ideas about how change happens. So one way of looking at it is saying that the locus of responsibility lies with the individual. It's the individual's responsibility to read the labels, make the right decisions, do the right things. And if you don't, it's because you are not taking responsibility for your actions. And I think that can lead to approaches that talk about labeling, education, informed choices, and so on and so forth. There's another way of looking at things which says actually we are all pretty much in thrall to the machinations of big companies, and we are kind of mindless zombies really, and that they are the problem and they need to change. So the locus of responsibility lies with them. And then there's another way of looking at it which says actually governments should govern, they should regulate, they should set the playing field, the endlessly discussed level playing field. It's their job to change things, and once they set the steer, then everything else can fall into place. And other ways of saying, look, our leaders aren't going to do anything, corporations aren't going to do it. It's about we the people. We should be taking action, not as consumers, but we the people as citizens. So you have these different ways of addressing the problem, of thinking about what the problem is and what the solutions look like. And then you have people like, I guess, academics who say, oh, it's also terribly complicated. It's everything. It's all these things. It's this ensnarled mess, which is, that famous, notorious obesity diagram, which showed the sort of the many causes of obesity. And it's like, okay, well, where do you identify the levers for change in that? It's kind of accurate, but what do you do? So that's another set of discussions. And then there's this question of need, and this is, it sounds that strays very much into the realms of the moral, but I think when it comes to food and indeed our environmental problems, that's really constantly what we're talking about. We have this kind of the Planetary Boundaries framework, which has been accepted by many within the environmental movement, but is obviously challenged by others. But it is, again, it's this idea of limits and enough that we breach at our peril. And once you have this idea of limits, then you are bringing in ideas about too much, and you're bringing in ideas about greed. And so one person's greed is another person's good night out. And we have particularly moralizing discussions about things like meat and about foods that are high in sort of calories and fat. We have different sets of discussions about alcohol, for example, which you could argue is a sort of unnecessary food, but within the environmental movement, it's not necessarily categorized as such. Or once you start talking about ideas of need and greed, you have to start questioning pretty much everything. A meal out, however kind of vegan it might be, should you be spending 30 quid on a meal that when you could be using that money to, I don't know, contribute to a good cause or something? What about the various aspects of our non-food lives that we all enjoy, like, the Lido? I went to my local Lido today for a swim. It happens to be heated. Now I am contributing to fossil fuels basically going up into the air so that I get to have my swim. Or I have a cat who is, definitely greedy, and I don't need to have him, and he's eating a lot of meat, nasty cat food. So again, we have these discussions about need and greed in the context of food, but it interacts in such complex ways with other aspects of our life that we take our judgments for granted, perhaps, and we don't necessarily question their inconsistencies and their illogicalities. And I think another set of discussions about food are these ideas about freedom. Freedom is this sort of very important principle, but what is it? Is it freedom to choose to have a million varieties of cereal or a million holiday destination opportunities? Is it freedom from the trappings of consumerism to live a simple life? Again, a kind of voluntary simplicity, very much in keeping with the sort of religious traditions. Or is it something kind of that is neither one of those things? It's more the kind of the freedom to self-determine, to make our own futures that we want to be. And where is the role of technology, and where are the boundaries in that? So I think there are different interpretations of what freedom is and how that drives ideas about how we should produce food, who should be producing it, what kinds of foods, what choices we have to make in society, and who or what, if anyone, should be regulating us or telling us what to do or guiding us. And then, like, really fundamentally, our discussions about nature and our relationship with it. So we have a lot of just, about the nature we have lost, and that we somehow need to get back to a good nature. But what is that good nature that we are trying to get back to? Is it the nature of like 200 years ago, or of 10,000 years ago? Where, at what point was our nature good that we needed to return to it? And how does food fit into that? Are we part of nature, so we farm with nature? And this is the whole land sparing, land sharing debate. Do we interact with it, or do we try and kind of squeeze ourselves into as a small a space as possible via intensive forms of food production, or indeed avoiding land altogether, so that we do not kind of pollute the natural world? And what does that say about our feelings about ourselves? And then how do we think about nature as opposed to the kind of the human and the social and the economic aspects of the ownership of nature and so forth? And that, I think, drives a lot of debates around rewilding. It's like, who gets to decide what we use our land for? And then again, we have some inconsistencies here. Which bits of nature that do we want? Do we want the bit of nature that kills us all, or that gives us babies when we don't want to have them? So are vaccines and contraceptives a good idea? Which bits of the unnatural do we accept? And again, it comes over again with food. So the whole debates around ultra processed foods, or bits about culture that we might want. So I'm of Greek origin, Cypriot origin, so I'm talking about my sort of Cypriot Greek heritage. But do we want the bits of culture that kind of keeps women at home and men out at work? Which bits of culture do we want? And then knowledge. So again, I think a lot of the disconnect in the discussions about food are people drawing, and again, we have this within the sort of academic world, people coming at things from different disciplines, whether it's the social sciences or the natural sciences, whether it's people doing very, very small scale sort of case study type work, as opposed to people focusing on the kind of the really, really big macro picture. And how and where do this kind of bottom up and the top down understandings of the world and of the food system, where do they just sort of do they have the hands join, or are they working always at cross purposes? And then how do we think about ideas about sort of metrics, and which metrics matter and which metrics count? We see this a lot in discussions about food. So, for example, this is an example of a packet of ready to go in the oven chips from Waitrose, which, as you can see from the traffic light labeling, looks pretty good from a nutritional point of view. But for another way of looking at it, that this food is a processed abomination, and that we need a different, those metrics are reductive, and that we need a different way of understanding the goodness of food, that takes away from the focus on an individual nutrient and looks at how the food interact, in the context of its production system, the power structures underlying it, and our overall diet. So the kind of different ways of thinking about the legitimacy of different kinds of knowledge. And of course, there's also the questions of kind of context. And again, this comes up in discussions about livestock. So we have all these tussles about which kinds of knowledge are more legitimate than which other kinds. And then there's theories of change and the arguments for the future. Are we arguing for a future that is based on the expectation that we can't really change anything very, very dramatically, so we should try and tweak it as much as possible? And that might lead to one set of recommendations and one kind of way forward. Or can we say, look, we just need to kind of rip the paper up. We need to start again. We need actually to go for a very radically different way forward. Otherwise, we kind of get locked in to a status quo that is going to come back and damage us further down the line. So that's kind of one set of discussions about the nature of change. And then there's other kinds which are about how we're motivated. Are we intrinsically or extrinsically motivated? There was that famous I am not a plastic bag thing that now sells for about £1 million on eBay, and it's just a bag, but it became a status symbol. How did that happen? Or we have the kind of flight shame movement originating in Scandinavia. Does shaming people, is that a theory of change that A, works, and B, works in the long term and is a good thing to do? Different people have different takes on this. And what do we do in the face of uncertainty? Do we take a precautionary principle, or do we feel that inertia is itself too risky and that we need to act now, because if we don't act, it's just going to be things will just get even worse. So I think there is this dynamic between, on the one hand, spending a lot of time thinking about all these problems, and on the other hand, just doing stuff and seeing what happens. And both those approaches can come back to bite us. So I think that's basically some of the sets of discussions that I think we have when we're really talking about food, and that is where we are now. A lot of latent disagreements about what our vision of a good food future looks like, and I think this is perhaps nowhere better exemplified than in discussions around the role of meat and livestock. So these were some sort of four futures. I put them together in a report called Gut Feelings a few years ago, and they kind of still hold true. I think we have a vision on the bottom right of this sort of intensive poultry future, which is predicated on the idea that people want meat, people can't change, the market can provide, that technology is the way forward. We can have kind of cleaner, greener, meaner, more efficient poultry that will give us what we want. We are free to consume, and we can do it in ways that basically we can have our cake and eat it, or our chicken. Another way of looking at it is to say, well, I take all those premises, but why not bypass the animal altogether and do it in a lab? And this is predicated also on an idea that we need to separate ourselves from the natural world, that the less impact we have on it, the better. And that, again, we can have what we want, and we can spare land for nature, and technology can save the day. And then for a kind of radically different take on it is an idea which is a kind of livestock on leftovers approach, which says that we have a long-standing relationship with animals, with the natural world, that we need to work with nature, that we are part of nature, and that if we were only to farm in ways that were attuned with nature, we could modify our appetites, that we can change, and that our appetites are malleable, and that we can be free from the kind of the pressures and the damage caused by a sort of relentless consumerism. And then finally, a sort of more radical still in some ways approach, which says that, you know, we need to do as little harm as possible. And one way of doing this is to disconnect ourselves at all, you know, from the processes of rearing and slaughter and so forth. So, you know, I don't have time to go into these in a huge amount of detail, but you can see how those 4 visions that you see all the time when you go about, you know, your lives, that grass-fed is good, grass-fed is bad, alternative proteins and plant burgers are the way forward, or they are evil ultra-processed things that are just have all been bought up by corporations, or that, you know, vegans are the way forward, veganism's the way forward, or veganism's, you know, full of, you know, self-absorbed, closed-minded fundamentalists, you know, different ways of understanding how we should go about changing or not changing what it is that we eat. So yeah, and I suppose this leads to the kind of so what factor, which is, so knowing this, how do you make policy? Is it not better to just get on and do stuff based without challenging your fundamental assumptions, or without probing other people's? And I guess I have a view, which is that I don't think that is the way forward. I think we really do need to talk about the values we bring to discussions about food, and how they shape the selection and use of evidences of many different kinds. And this really is why we set up Table, which was really to try and dig down a little bit more deeply, taking as its starting point the fact that, you know, obviously science is essential, it's absolutely essential, but it is not sufficient in itself, that it can't tell us what a good food system looks like, and we need to
I think we've lost Tara for a moment. Hopefully she'll be back on in a second.
we
Hi Tara, can you hear us? We lost you.
how much did you lose?
You just begun on your first table slide. Maybe go back from the top of that slide. Is that right?
Slide. Okay, let me just go back to it. So, and am I sharing my screen?
No, you'll need to reshare.
Okay.
Still be a co-host.
Okay, I'm going to share this screen. Okay, so
I think we're losing you again. Tara, maybe do you want to drop your video? I don't know if you can hear. So that we just have the screen streaming.
Yeah, I'll share the screen. Stop video. Can you see my screen now?
That's coming through for me. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, it says my internet connection's unstable. So just want to say about Table, it's a collaboration between Oxford, Wageningen and the Swedish Agricultural University. It's grounded in academia, but it's not kind of formally academic. Our hope is to be more kind of looser and a bit more experimental, and very much more about engaging with different food system stakeholders as kind of co-creators of knowledge and of ideas, and to have this kind of two-way conversation. So, you know, I think the things that we try and do are sort of explore what underlies many of the disagreements, taking a kind of both a thematic approach and a topics-based approach. So we had a project the trial initial project, which looked at scale in the food system. So that many of the discussions about food are discussions about what a good scale for the food system is. Is it ongoing globalization? Is it relocalizing? Is big beautiful or big bad? These different scales of the scale of our moral responsibility. Who do we owe a duty of care to? You know, both in terms of people living near to us and people far away, but also species close to us and species far away. So that was our first project, which was really took the form of a lot of interviews with a range of kind of different thinkers, academics, people working in civil society, people from the corporate sector, who addressed the scale question from their different perspectives. And it gave rise to, a report where we sort of kind of summarized all that and sort of 14 podcast episodes. Our more recent new theme is actually focusing on the question of power as it relates to protein. So what we want to do there is really trying to understand the ways in which people think about power and how many of the discussions about protein, very loosely defined, of protein futures, how they manifest different understandings of what power is, who has it, who ought to have it, and where we want to go with all this. So we've just started, and we're trying to walk the talk as well, and try and be a little bit more kind of introspective and self-reflective. So as we go about focusing on power, what are the dynamics of power in our own decision-making processes? As a small team of 7 or 8 people, how do we go about thinking about that? So those are the 2 themes that we're working on, and we have a lot of topics that we try and explore. We've got 2 new ones coming up, one focusing on ideas about some of the debates around rewilding, and another one focusing on eco-modernism as a kind of as a movement, and again the contestations around that. And that's an approach we've taken to other sort of concepts, from things like food sovereignty to some of the debates around ultra processed foods, or ideas about what we mean by environmental efficiency, and what does efficiency actually mean. So it's that kind of exploratory approach. We have a kind of podcast series, which I mentioned, and we're just launching our new one on which is going to be focused again on power, and so that's just started. We're also trying to be a little bit more sort of experimental in the sorts of things that we produce. We did this little visual, which was kind of quite popular. It really tries to explore some of the, I wonder if I can get it up here, the interactive diagram. It sort of tries to explore some of the kind of the similarities and differences between regenerative agriculture, which is one of these words that I still don't actually know what it means, organic, and agroecology. And we just used it as a kind of discussion piece, and had quite a lot of interesting commentary on that. And we want to do a little bit more of this sort of visualization and sort of gamification of ideas. And then we have a kind of community platform, and we're trying to build that up to try and get people to, talk to one another, share ideas, and so on and so forth, and a series of events that some that we've held, and some that we have planned forward. But the main point I want to say about Table is that we are really, really open to collaboration and to ideas, and what we want it to be is something that is our goal is not to produce highly cited peer-reviewed papers. Our goal is for people to provide opportunities for people to kind of think and reflect, to write things for us, to co-organize.
Tara, I don't know if you can hear, but audio's dropped off for me. You might need to recap the goals if you're still on.
Events or activities with us, but really don't talk to so-and-so. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. So I am going to unshare my screen and then hopefully stop share. Have I stopped my share?
It's still there for me. I can.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah, great. If you stop the share, maybe you can pop your video on for the Q&A. Now we might have enough bandwidth. Excuse me. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for giving us such a wide-ranging overview of the many dimensions of food system debates and things that we need to consider when talking about the future. We have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So if anyone has a question or a comment or a suggestion, please use the raise hand function or pop something in the chat. Give people a couple of moments. I might start with one actually while people are getting their thoughts together then. You mentioned the global versus local scale debate that you'd had over the last year, and it raised the question for me of, well, actually, what is the approach? What is the scale at which you try and have the debate, even, because obviously we have a globalized food system and companies that are reaching into multiple countries, but policies are still made mostly at a national level. So how do you have how do you think about the globalized nature of the food system while keeping it focused enough to be informative to policy and decision making?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, and I think it's one that could probably be, I'll have a go at it from a couple of different angles. So one way of answering that question is to say, if we're talking about scale in the food system, how do we even choose who we go and talk to? And are we going to be talking just to people quite close to us, or are we going to try and reach out and engage with people from further afield? And as we all know, it's going to be a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So it's going to, you start with a few people and you try and reach out. And in fact, we have been having this discussion like more broadly, that we want to engage more with institutions and researchers in the global south. And one idea that we have is to have a partnership with one, but then which individual institution is going to represent the global south, and how tokenistic does that sound? So how do you sort of address this idea of how do you work at this sort of global level without being either very bland or tokenistic or very piecemeal? And I don't think we've really got an answer to that. What we tried to do with the Scale project was talk to people who come at issues around food from very, very different sort of scales of resolution, from people who work in the field on particular very localized projects to people who are involved more in sort of global modeling type studies. And I think everyone's got a kind of a piece of the puzzle. And we also had some interviews with people who are we're thinking about the nature of policy making and how policy is made, and the influences on that policy, and also these ideas of inclusivity and representation that so kind of beriddled the UN Food System Summit talks as well. And what I got from listening to everybody and trying to, we had somebody who was working with us who tried to make sense of it all was in the end, you just come back to it with a slightly richer understanding that what we need is diversity. So we need diversity of scales of production and provisioning. We also need more diversity of levels of decision making. It's not that it's one thing or it's the other. The problem is that it's heading in one direction, and that kind of precludes the possibility of other ways of doing things, and you lose that resilience. So I think I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I think it was a very difficult and open-ended question, so I think that's a good answer. Thank you. I'll cede the floor, see if anyone has a question to put their hands up. Tim Malone, to go start off.
Thank you. Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Tara. That was a fascinating overview, fascinating talk, actually. I mean, we're never, you've hit the nail on the head. We're never going to have, it's a very, very complex system. We're never going to have one perfect system. And there would probably be, we probably wouldn't want one perfect system, even if we had that. These things have come up. We're much more aware of it because we're facing a planetary emergency, and that's why there's much more interest in this. And our values, the values we take in it, are so much influenced by our society, our communication, our community that we're involved in. There's going to be different solutions in different parts of the country, different parts of the world. So there's never going to be one right thing. What do you think? I mean, apart from having the debate, which I think is probably the most important aspect, what do you think are the things that actually push the subject along, with the urgency that it needs? I mean, I'm puzzled that, for example, so many young people in this country have shown an interest in vegetarian and vegan diets, which is incredibly positive. But I wouldn't have predicted that 15, 20 years ago. What do you think are the factors pushing things along?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Sometimes it's quite random, isn't it? And it's quite happenstance. I think the later we leave things, the more people get galvanized. When it comes to the whole vegetarian vegan thing, I think that's a really, really difficult question. And there's many ways of answering it, some of which are probably quite cynical. I think one way of answering it is to say that people feel they have no agency about anything at all, but they can change the way they eat. Partly the rise in preoccupation about health and the individual has led to a focus on that, and then the environmental aspects of it get bolted onto it as and guess what, I'm being ethical. Partly, I think it's the rise in kind of commercial inroads. Commerce has got in on the act and made it easier to be ethical. You don't have to try quite so hard. But I think it's also, again, it's just this part of the fact that that kind of old civic policy campaigning type activities have been is part of a movement towards the sort of individualization of I suppose identity politics and all the rest of it. So it's not like there's lots and lots of other things that are at play when it comes to vegetarianism, and whether it's a good meal or a bad meal is up for discussion. When it comes to sort of like how change happens, as far as I can see, usually you have a really great understanding of how change happens when it has happened, and then you look back and you say, well, it was a bit of this and it was a bit of that. And going back to the whole smoking thing, it's there were so many things that happened that didn't have any effect at all, and then suddenly things fall into shape. And I think that's possibly where we are at the moment with food. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Good question, Tim. We have a couple of comments and questions in the chat. One question for Tara is, how does imagination, or how do we conceive food sovereignty looking like within predominantly import-dependent northern countries? How do we kind of visualize a food future for countries that are not food independent?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Are you
sorry? How does the imagination, or how do we imagine? So I guess questions of food sovereignty within predominantly import-dependent northern countries.
Right. Yeah. Again, this is very difficult. So I mean, I think the first thing to say is that my understanding of food sovereignty is that it's not anti-imports, it's anti-having imports thrust upon you. It's about the right to self-determine, the right to choose the terms of trade. So I think that's one thing to note. I think some of the discussions about food sovereignty, they can often be simplified into discussions about food miles, and somebody somewhere will say, but did you know it's better to import New Zealand land than to grow it locally because of food miles, because of the carbon footprint, or whatever it might be. So I think the first thing we need to do is actually look at the many different factors that people are actually thinking about when they advocate a particular position or not. If we are kind of talking about food sovereignty as a kind of a shift towards greater self-sufficiency, I'm kind of really ambivalent about this, and I don't know if other people have a sort of a clearer position. I can see, part of me is very much along the lines that a shift towards self-sufficiency can lead to a more bioregional approach to production, in which you don't have to have everything from everywhere all the time, and that kind of simplifies things, and it simplifies the nature of policy making, which means that you have perhaps better oversight over things. I think there can be a really, really scary alliance between ideas about sovereignty and nationalism and the whole keep out foreign stuff ethos, which I think is really, I find that quite scary. So, and obviously on the third hand, you don't want to be importing other people's environmental devastation. So I think there are all these factors at play, and I don't know what the right way forward is. I think there's going to be bits of right way forward, and I think questioning our need, and this is my personal values here, which perhaps tend a bit more towards the sort of we're too greedy end of things. I think that we should be questioning our inalienable right to have everything from everywhere all the time, and moving perhaps towards sort of more simpler, less sort of demanding kinds of diets. But at the same time, I think we need to address terms of trade so that they're fair and just, and to do that in a spirit of kind of global cooperation. So how you do that is going to be tricky.
Thank you. We have, I think, it's time for one more question, and I have a hand up from Veronica. Do you want to go ahead?
Yes, hi, thank you so much. That was a really insightful presentation, and I enjoyed getting to learn more about Table and the work that you all do. So you talked a lot about sort of power inequalities, agency, responsibility. I'm really interested in all these things, and I'm curious, how do we ensure that marginalized voices and disadvantaged populations are really included in these conversations to create positive change, and that their kind of very different types of knowledge are recognized in trying to create that change?
Yeah, I think there's at least two questions in that. One is the kind of the fora for inclusion, and I think that's really difficult. And I think as an academic or semi-academic at Oxford, you know, inclusivity is not necessarily Oxford's forte, or, you know, or the world that we live in's forte. You know, it's so attempts at reaching out and being more inclusive, and I'm just talking about kind of the work we do. You go, you know, how you do that, and how you create these spaces where there are problems of, like, really practical ones, problems of internet access, or, you know, technology and all the rest of it, as well as, you know, the time and the money and the resourcing and all the rest of it, and the just time that it takes to get together and just to understand something, and then the kind of the politics of knowledge. I think that's an ongoing question, isn't it? How you understand different people's ways of knowing, but also don't descend into some kind of vortex of anything goes subjectivity. So I don't know how you balance that. And yeah, I would actually turn the question on anyone here, you know, has anyone seen a really good example of either of those things? I'd be really, really interested to find out, to learn more.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Right, we're 2 minutes to the end. I know some people need to leave for the event. If anyone has a burning question that they'd like to add, or indeed a good answer to Tara's question on the forums for making inclusive collaboration and just dialogue happen, please go ahead. Otherwise, I'm sure we can follow up on email or through table afterwards.
Please get in touch, because yeah, and you know, subscribe to our podcast and all the rest of it. That would be lovely.
The podcast is really good. I can also just plug that. I've listened to several of them now, and they're always really thought-provoking. Great, brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Tara, for sharing your work with us. I'm sure there'll be some follow-ups and lots of people heading to the Table Debates website right after this. Yeah, and yeah, well, hopefully we'll stay in touch, and some collaboration can come out of this as well. So thank you, and take care, everyone.